I struggled with becoming a parent and saying, how do I raise a kid? My own. They didn't come with a manual, or did yours? Yours did, okay. We had to sort things out, didn't we? And we've seen more than one person be transformed by having a child, haven't we? I remember a particular one that when nobody thought he would ever learn how to be a father, but guess what? When that kid showed up, he was a different person. I just want to take a few minutes and back up a moment, because I think we need to understand a few things about parenting this morning. And I know some of you are like myself. There's no little kids around at Christmas. Okay? But there's grandkids along the way somewhere, and maybe even great-grandkids for some of you. And why do we do child dedication? I want to back up a little bit. Why do we make a public ceremony of saying we want to dedicate this child? And I want to continue on our journey to Bethlehem, and I want to take us to a point that happened after Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem that we don't often talk about at Christmas time. It's probably more of a New Year's Day sermon, but we're going to start on it today. And that is, on the 8th day, they took the child to be circumcised and named him Jesus at that time. And then it was the time for their purification offering as required by the law of Moses after the birth of a child. And so his parents took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Now, if we go back and look at this from an Old Testament standpoint, there was a sacrificial system that was involved, that when you had particularly a firstborn son, you were to bring him and present him to the Lord. And then there was a sense of which he was kind of a redeemer to the rest of the kids. And it specifically says firstborn son, although this translation has child. It's the idea that we are now saying that this child is also a gift given to us from God. And we need to understand that we only have them for a little while. I know a family life speaker who says, how many of you are the parent of a 9-year-old? And then a number of hands go up, and he says, did the first 9 years go fast? Everybody goes, yeah. And he says, second 9 years go a lot faster. And they're gone. And as parents, we have a responsibility to involve God in the process. We do not do child baptism or infant baptism because there's a misnomer out there that says that if you have a child baptized, that guarantees his eternity. Now, hold with me for a moment. Because a merciful God would make a plan for a child that dies. Okay? But there does come a point where a child begins to understand the difference between right and wrong. And a child begins to become a man or a woman. And a child gets to the point where he makes his own decisions. And our job as parents is to help them get through that stage where they learn how to make right decisions. Decisions that are based upon truth and decisions that are based upon consequences, until they come to the point someday when on their own, and no coercion and no parading involved, where they realize that until they give their life to Jesus Christ, they are not in God's family. Now that sounds kind of harsh to say, but at the same time, when we understand that and we come back and understand that this whole plan of Christmas and this whole plan of going to Bethlehem was a part of God's way to deal with man's sinfulness and woman's sinfulness. That we cannot fix it on our own. Because all I have to do is tell you, you shouldn't, and your mind is beginning to think of why you should and how you can. In fact, we even have a psychology called negative thinking. No, it's not negative thinking. Whatever it is. Reverse psychology. That's what it is. Ever get somebody to do something because you simply told them the opposite of what you wanted done and they were right on that? We have a way of just doing what we're told not to do. In fact, many of you, when you were told to sit down, you sat down and you kind of said, I may be sitting down on the outside, but on the inside, I am still standing up. Because we have inherent sinful nature that desires nothing more than to drag us down. Yesterday at the memorial service, they sang a song. Don and Larry sang a song about that long black train. Maybe you know it. But it talks about how the rails of sin and that engineer guide us to jump on this train that looks so pretty, but its destination is nowhere. And I want us to think it through a little bit this morning with a different twist than what I normally do. Because I think in our day and age, we have tended to lose this whole idea of what it means to sacrifice, what it means to give up to somebody else. The me-first society has drowned us out to where we have gotten to the point where it's all about me. And I was told when we started the church, and I still find it true today, people ask the question, what have you done for me? It's not what have you done for me, it's what have you done for me today? And I just want us to begin to realize that we think having a child is all about us. Wrong, right? You've already learned that in what, a few short months. But you can't say in the middle of the night, I'll be with you in a few hours, don't bother me tonight. When you're exhausted, you've already learned that you have to crawl out of bed and go take care of the child. We were fortunate enough to have one that woke up in the morning and would play for an hour or two in the crib. Not the rest of them. There comes a sense, too, that we need to understand in this whole process that not only did Mary and Joseph have an incredible cost involved in this, and it went beyond finances. Their cost was beyond a motel night and a few extra nights at an extended stay place in Bethlehem. It went way beyond the fact that they had to travel away from home. Their cost was also in humility, because you know what happened when they returned home? Joseph probably tried to do his construction business, his cabinet shop, and people were saying, we know what happened and we're not associating with you. And there was this whole process that we just got to the point where we've lost the fact that this thing was incredibly costly. Now, we also live in a society today that says, if I love my child, I'm going to give them everything they want. And we've gotten to the point where we can't even say no to a child, and yet the Bible clearly tells us that if we spare the rod, we spoil the child. If we do nothing, we have allowed a child to grow up the same way that rivers become crooked, because there's no resistance to help them understand right from wrong, and there's no sense of consequences for actions. The scriptures tell us there's consequences for our actions. And sometimes our actions are good. We do good things and we get good consequences. And sometimes we've done some bad things and there's negative consequences. Boy, growing up in our household, when I did something wrong, there were consequences. My mother had a little metal chair, made me sit in the corner. I don't know if it was more punishment to her or to me, because I did not sit still. I still don't sit still. There is a challenge in our lives to learn how as parents to be the right sacrificial. And you know, sometimes that sacrificial and that giving as parents and grandparents is not giving. How many of you got a long list from your grandkids this year? An impossible list to fill. He presented them to God. They gave the sacrifice of a poor family, doves or pigeons. If you were wealthy, you had to give a lamb. And they presented the boy Jesus to the Father. I find it fascinating that when we start talking about this whole idea of sacrifice, that it really comes down to a Greek word. And the Greek word is called agape. And agape love is not that, oh, I feel good type love, or we're good friends love. It has with it two meanings. One is, I am committed to you and to your best interest and welfare. And the second one is, I am willing to do whatever it takes to make it happen. And sometimes the idea of agape love is not pleasant. In fact, Jesus, after Peter denied him 3 times and felt guilty and horrible and like a failure, and when the disciples said, what are you going to do now? He says, I'm going fishing. I'm going back to my old lifestyle. I'm out of here because I can't handle this anymore. And of course, you know what happens when he went fishing? Didn't catch any fish. Jesus said, try the other side of the boat. Try the other side of the boat. Then they realized that Jesus was filling the boat. Peter, this is humorous. He was stripped for fishing, and when he realized it was Jesus, he put his coat on and jumped in the water to swim ashore. And when he got ashore, Jesus had a breakfast there, and he invited Peter to come over because he wanted to offer mercy and forgiveness to Peter. And mercy and forgiveness only came after confrontation and connection. And he asked Peter that if he really loved me, he says, Peter, do you really love me? Do you care for me? And are you committed to me? And will you sacrifice for me? And Peter says, I kind of like you. And then Jesus makes this really interesting statement after 2 or 3 conversations. And in John chapter 21, when he's asking him to feed his sheep, Jesus says to Peter, I want to tell you something, buddy. You accept this challenge, and you're going to be wrapped up and tied up and crucified because you're following me. Come, follow me. Wow, what an invitation. Hey, folks, you're going to die, but come, follow me. And I just want to remind you this morning that he was telling Peter this because he was going to get a chance to glorify God. Now, tradition has it, and it's only tradition, that Peter was crucified for following Jesus. But he told him to crucify him upside down because he was not worthy to die in the same manner that his Lord did. There's a incredible calling here for us to learn how to love people sacrificially. You know, my calling to Christ came with some incredible changes in my life. We moved. Went from living in a rural small town out on 2 acres of ground to living really close to the freight yards in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was a little noisier if you've never lived around freight yards, train freight yards. It involved us moving several times, pulling up our stakes and saying goodbye to friends and making new friends. But man, what a journey. What an opportunity. It's fascinating that when we get over to Romans chapter 12, we find these interesting verses to us about this whole idea of living a lifestyle where we're willing to give up. But what I really want to point out to you is, and I do not have it up here, is that Romans 12 starts out with the words therefore. Do you know what you need to do when you see a verse starting out or a chapter starting out with the words therefore? Find out why it's there for. It's a simple question. It wasn't trick. Therefore. So what's the therefore? If you go back to Romans 11, Romans 11's finishing up the section that Paul was writing to the Roman Jews. And in that passage, he's starting, the question is, well, wait a minute. Jesus said that he was going to cut off the Jewish nation and graft the Gentiles in. And Paul came along, and there seems to be this sense that the Jews have no hope. And Paul's writing to them and saying, by the mercies of God, he is going to work something out in their lives. It's the same thing for you and I. We might have made some mistakes, and we might have done some wrong things, and we might have gone down the wrong road for a long time. But by the mercies of God, he has brought you to where he is. And he talks about how great God is in this process. And then he says, therefore, I urge you, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. These people knew what it meant to sacrifice. They watched animals being sacrificed to God. But I want you to be a living sacrifice. I want you to crawl on an altar that's going to be hot. Living sacrifices have a tendency to crawl off, don't we? When the pressure gets too hot, what's the first thing we do? I'm out of here. This isn't what I signed up for. I quit. If we present, and why does he talk about our bodies? I'll tell you why. Because that's really where you are. How many times has you said to somebody, or you had somebody say to you either way, I'll pray for you? How many times when you told somebody you'd pray for them, did you actually really ever pray for them? How many times have you said to somebody, hey, I can't make the meeting, but I'll be there in spirit? You know what that means? I ain't thinking about you when I'm on the golf course. It means absolutely nothing except an ease of conscience. And so when Paul says, put your bodies there, the rest of you will come as well. Don't conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Because I'm convinced that the world wants to squeeze us into their mold. They wants to twist us and conform us to become just like everybody else. And all I'm saying this morning is that we need to be different, and it starts right here. That's why it's important to read the Word. That's why it's important to understand the Word. Because our life, if you really want to change something, it starts in our mind. That's why the battle for our mind is so important. Because when our mind begins to think it, sooner or later, we can start to believe it. And when then we begin to believe it about us, that's when we change our lives. That's when we stand out as a bright, shiny star in a dark world that's corrupt. That's when the peace that we sing about and pray about can be shared with other people, because it first began in my mind. Then I began to believe it about me. And then it became a part of my behavior. Our calling to Christ is about changed lives, about reflecting who He is. And that means there are some things that we have to walk away from so that we can be transformed into His image. It's a journey and it's a process. And it begins with His coming to us, not only as a baby, but knowing full well, and Mary and Joseph knowing full well, that someday He was going to die on a cross so that our past lives could be forgiven and our new lives could be shaped in His image. That's why we celebrate communion, because there's an element in which we understand that the broken body of Jesus Christ, His sacrifice in our place, brought wholeness to us. And that spilled out blood, that was for the forgiveness of our sins. And those things that haunt you from your past need to be covered with that blood. The cross is the crossing point from us being our own sinful nature and driven to selfishness, and understanding that we have an eternal life ahead of us. It's a challenge to present our bodies, but Jesus presented his body for us. Our Father, we pause in this moment.